first thing we're doing is engaging in advocacy on this issue. That's one of the reasons we're here in New York today, is to advocate at the UN, the meetings that are happening beforehand, to create relationships, to build the political momentum for change on this issue. With 0.8 degrees of warming so far, we're already committed, frankly, to over a 1 degree of warming, because the inertia from what was produced 2 decades ago is still in the system, pushing us forward. We're committed to additional warming, even if we stopped all greenhouse gases right now. You know, it's like biblical proportions, the droughts, the storms, the floods in Australia, the bushfires. So it's not just, of course, in developing countries, but in developing countries, poor people living on less than $1.20 a day or just don't have the coping mechanisms. They don't have insurance. They don't have a government that's going to fly in and provide temporary shelter, or, you know, they are just living on the edge day to day. There's a study that was published, quite an important study. It actually led to an op-ed in the Washington Post that some of you may have read, where the scientists looked at extreme weather in the periods from 1950, the 3 decades, 50s, 60s, and 70s, and then compared them to the extreme weather in the 80s, 90s to 2000. In that first 3-decade period, extreme weather covered about 0.1 to 0.2% of the planet at any given moment. In the subsequent 3 decades, it's covering 10% of the planet. If you think about that, so what that means is, even though our average temperature has only increased by 0.85 degrees Celsius, the impact that's had on extreme weather has been enormous. It's almost a 100-fold increase in terms of the impact. And that's with 0.8 degrees of warming. We're going to 4, 5, possibly 6 degrees of warming. It is inconceivably bad, that sort of change. The impact on extreme weather, in just extreme weather, is going to be enormous. We've got the science telling us that the deadline is rapidly approaching, where if we don't CO2 emissions don't peak and begin reducing at very extreme levels, we will surpass the point at which the climate is going to cause devastating impacts. The World Bank, for example, has been leading an initiative on carbon pricing, which in my view is probably the only way we're going to reduce rapidly enough to prevent, in the time that's required, to prevent the really devastating warming. 73 countries signed up to in support of carbon pricing, 1,000 businesses. Those entities represent 50% of all the greenhouse gas emissions that are produced and over 50% of global GDP. As the price of carbon goes up, then renewables become more competitive, investments in developing new technologies, the energy efficiency, it just gives a huge boost to all of those changes we need to move to a zero net carbon economy, or a focus on more renewable sources of energy. In Brisbane, during a peak energy demand, there was zero drain on, it was 100% of the energy demand was provided by solar energy, distributed solar energy in Brisbane. In Germany, something like 37%, maybe Sven remembers this, there was 37% of energy was renewable energy, and there was one day where there was actually a peak 75% in one day of peak renewable energy. This March was the first time the coalition came together. It hadn't happened before. Faith leaders, labor unions, NGOs, environmental organizations, women's groups, you name it, they were there marching. So there's tremendous work underway around the world. CARE is not just, we're working on the advocacy at the global, regional, and national levels. We're also helping communities adapt to very practical tools that are being used now by many other organizations, and in very direct ways helping them cope with the climate change that we're already seeing. Everywhere we work, almost everywhere, in the communities we're working with, people are seeing disruptions to rain, the frequency of rains, or the patterns, droughts, and so on. And so we're working to help them adapt. And we're doing this. Actually, CARE is a leader around the world. I feel very proud of the work Sven and others, and Dorcas and others are doing around the world, actually developing the tools to help communities adapt to climate change. And those tools are being used by other organizations across the world, tools that CARE has developed. There are a few things we're focusing on, a few ideas we're developing. For example, CARE is one of the founders of microcredit community savings activities around the world. And we have this network, particularly in Africa, where we're probably the largest provider of CSA, community savings activities. It's a huge network that you can use, that you can draw upon and use as a foundation for adaptation, climate change adaptation as well. These are the reasons I'm optimistic, in spite of what is a horribly sad situation on the ground for poor people. And it's also why I am doing whatever I can to develop our capacity to respond, our humanitarian response capacity. Our next steps are, because the scale of the crisis is so huge, even with CARE as one of the largest NGOs in the world, the scale is so huge of the problem that we need to scale up what we're doing.